All right, this is Slava P. Welcome to the first episode of So-Called Canada.
Our home on a native land.
Fuck it, we're going to ride that out. I like that. So-Called Canada. Multiculturalism. Does it work? I don't think so. A lot of other people seem to disagree. Let's go through it. Now, if you went to school in Canada, you're probably familiar with the concept of melting pot or mosaic. You've come to understand that America has a bit of a melting pot. All these other cultures come to Canada, but they all become American as a result of living in Canada. America has a melting pot where all these different cultures live there, but they all become American as a result of living in America. Canada, on the other hand, is supposed to be a mosaic, which means that everybody can move here and retain their own culture. And that is what makes Canada, allegedly, a beautiful place to live. But what does it mean to be Canadian? We haven't really figured that out, even though we've been all of these mosaic multiculturals for the past 60 years. You could argue that a big part of what it means to be Canadian is wondering what it means to be Canadian. So Northrop Frye was an author, and he was like the mentor to Margaret Atwood. That's how old he is. He wrote something called Conclusion to a Literary History of Canada. And he talked about how we have a garrison mentality, which means that to be a true Canadian, you need to think of things as if you're in a garrison. A garrison's like a small wartime village that only has you and a certain amount of people in it. It's like a very tribal mentality sort of thinking. It lends itself really well to this idea of us being a mosaic. Now, nobody's arguing that the mosaic concept has failed. What I'm wondering is if the multiculturalism that we were promised is even a good thing. What I want to say is that Canada has no culture. Canada has no culture because it's failed to set any sort of baseline that's true for anybody that comes here. Anytime anybody talks about Canada having a culture, they point to one of three things. They say we're welcoming of all different types of culture, we all watch hockey, and we all consume the same products, namely Tim Hortons coffee cups. Let's look at why that's not exactly true. So according to a 2016 Canadian census, 22% of Canadians identified as a visible minority. And in 2021, Toronto had 46.6% of its population listed as foreign-born. That means 1 in 2 people walking around Toronto were not even born in the country of Canada. That's pretty cool because no other place on earth has that many people from all different spots living in one area. We also have a bunch of different languages, even though our official languages are English and French. There's been 200 languages reported as home languages as early as the 2016 census. So if we're not all speaking the same language, are we at least having the same experiences while we're in Canada? Do we all shop at the same grocery store where our paths could cross in this beautiful harmony of life? Not really. Everybody stays within their own little ethnic enclaves to the point where some stores in Markham, Ontario don't even have English on their signs. Children of immigrants maintain their accents as a result of being raised in these enclaves. You could move to a new country and speak the way that you would have back home, even though you were raised in that country. But hey, at least we all drink Tim Hortons, right? Now, Tim Hortons, it's a once iconic Canadian brand. But a lot of people don't know that it was actually acquired by a Brazilian company in 2014. It's not the only one, though. A lot of Canadian companies have been taken over by international organizations. Molson, a well-known Canadian brewery, merged with Coors in 2016 to form Molson Coors Brewing. Now, those are our two main things, coffee and beer. If when you're drinking them, you're not even consuming Canadian culture, what does it mean to actively participate and be a Canadian? We don't really make things in Canada. You can look at a country like China and see all the ways that they've managed to export soft power by producing companies like Huawei. Funny enough, Huawei actually bought the rights to Hockey Night in Canada a few years ago, and they were the main sponsor. We don't really have any industry here. There's no tech sector like there is in America, and the most we've managed to get is maybe Shopify or BlackBerry, both of which have various levels of success. Look at our national sports teams, and you can see exactly which companies pay the bills. The Raptors sponsor, insurance company. Baseball, TD Bank. Our fucking hockey sponsor is milk. Like, just the concept of milk. That's it. The biggest team in Canada is just milk. Nobody else thinks that's crazy. Speaking of hockey, that's the one thing that everybody always talks about, right? That's what it means to be a Canadian, is you have to hockey. You don't have to watch hockey. You don't have to play hockey. You just have to like hockey. You have to talk like a hockey player. You have to be aware of the knowledge of hockey. Now, I hate to break it to you, but according to Hockey Canada itself, hockey's popularity is on the decline. The cost of playing organized sports has increased so heavily that in 2019, a survey by the Canadian Youth Sports Report found that 70% of Canadian parents cited costs as a barrier to entry in youth sports participation. And hockey is one of the most expensive sports that you could play, especially if you're a goalie. If you're a goalie, you're constantly paying for equipment, not to mention ice time and transportation to get there and back. Now, according to Statistics Canada, the percentage of Canadians who identify hockey as their favorite sport has been on a steady decline for years. In 2016, the 5 most popular sports in Canada were golf, soccer, running, and basketball. And obviously, hockey was the number one in those. However, it declined in 2018 and then again when it was asked in 2021. A poll conducted by Leger for Association of Canadian Studies found that less than a third of Canadians follow hockey the most closely of any sport every year. So if we don't even have hockey, what do we have in Canada that makes being a Canadian a thing? What does it mean to be Canadian? How do you participate in being Canadian? How do you participate in Canadian culture? Well, we kind of have to ask what makes a culture, and this is a complicated answer. Because I would say it boils down to 4 things. You need a common language, you need a common set of arts that you're enjoying, you need a religion, and you need a common set of enemies. So, in the last decade, for the most part in Canada's history, we've been French. You know, even before we were called Canada, we were called New France, and we've only been Canada for about 156 years. A lot of what made Canada recognizable on the world stage was French stuff. Some Americans still think that we speak French in Toronto. Now, if you were to point to Toronto, which is definitely, I would say as a Torontonian, the most exciting place in Canada, the way that the cultures have shifted here in the last 10 years have been decidedly Caribbean. But that's true only of Toronto. You don't really see a big dance hall scene erupting in Edmonton or Vancouver. But all of those are almost accidental creations. These are not things that are sanctioned by the government of Canada to exist within Canada. They're almost things that happen as a result of a void being filled, a cultural void, if you will. Because Canada never laid out what it means to be Canadian, you don't know what you're supposed to do to be a proper citizen. That's what makes people retain so much of their original culture, is the fact that there's nothing new to cling on to. If there was something strong in Canada that would make people proud to be Canadian, I'm sure a lot of people wouldn't hesitate to identify as one. But right now, you'd be hard-pressed to think of anything that is Canadian culture. Language laws are not very heavily enforced anywhere in Canada except Quebec, and Quebec is almost mandating that you speak French by fear of punishment. They actually just introduced a thing where you have to pay more money if you're an English-speaking student in Quebec. So Quebec is actively trying to keep French people in Quebec so that they can continue to speak French. Nowhere else in Canada is doing that and taking care of our culture, at least the language portion of our culture. Quebec is actually special because they have a whole TV channel where they just rip off existing shows and put them in French. Like instead of The Voice, there's La Voix. Or like Love Island, they have a Quebecois version of it, actually. And funny enough, Just for Laugh Gags, which a lot of people don't know is the most famous show to come out of Canada, is a Quebec show. And that's because it actually doesn't use any language whatsoever. They just speak in like actions. How It's Made. How It's Made is another big Quebecois show because they just filmed how things are made. And then you can dub it over with whatever voiceovers that you need to, whether they be English or French. Another part of culture is the arts that you guys enjoy collectively as a culture. Now, everything that Canadians enjoy, including things that you probably watched before this YouTube video and after this YouTube video, are made in America. There's a very thin membrane separating American culture and Canadian culture to the point where it's non-existent. Canada tries to spend money on culture, but it always results in some kind of CBC show that like 400 people watch, but everyone talks about how important it is. And I really don't know what the solution to that is, because it's good that the CBC funds shows like that because nobody else is. But at the same time, the Canadian government actively suppresses the free market when it comes to technology companies being able to reach all Canadians. So you seeing this video is contributing more to the growth of culture in Canada than you tuning into the CBC in some weird, perverse way. The only examples of Canadian culture that are only true to Canada are the Tragically Hip, Rush, and maybe Leonard Cohen. but he did leak out a little bit. Americans know who Leonard Cohen is. A lot of Americans don't know who the Tragically Hip or Rush are, except for that song Tom Sawyer, because I think it was used in a movie or a Family Guy episode. But this means that any artists that currently come out of Canada are automatically looking for American approval to think that they're good enough. It's not enough as a Canadian artist to gain the acceptance of Canadians anymore. Common enemies? You want to talk about common enemies? Canada has none. We're the most pacifist country in the world, and for the most part, we do whatever America's doing. This stereotype of us being nice only comes from the comparison to Americans, who, let's face it, Canadians are scared of because Americans have guns. That's what it used to mean to be Canadian. That was the closest thing we had to culture. Hey, they're nice people up in Canada. And that's because, yeah, we were nice compared to Americans. Now, there's barely any difference. Well, the thing is, as immigration increases, the problems will get worse until we find a common culture that we convince everybody to assimilate into. We have to identify values that are unique to Canada, because a country that stands for nothing but acceptance is not really going to work out going forward. You need to draw a line somewhere. As it exists right now, you can come here from another country, you can move to an environment where you can keep speaking the dialect you were speaking, listening to the music you were listening to back home, and watching the movies that you were watching back home. There's nothing Canadian that you can adopt that would make you Canadian. There's no Canadian content that you can consume that would make you Canadian enough. And how can you ask someone to be a Canadian when that doesn't mean anything? You choose to come to a progressive country where you will learn to assimilate and integrate. You can't go to a new country and demand that they adopt your way of thinking. The easiest case of this that I can see in Canada that exists right now is LGBT rights. I did some time with a guy in prison who described Canada as a socialist country that believes in private property and gay rights. And you know what? That's probably the closest thing we have to a national identity. So let's lean into that. If you want to live in Canada, you have to be accepting of the LGBT. And that's maybe a line that we should draw in the sand, even if it goes against some other things like religion. Because here's the thing. We don't need to stop immigration. Okay, maybe we shouldn't let people come here and get their diploma in like a strip mall, but that doesn't mean that we need to bring it down to zero. That's crazy. We're a huge country and we should be taking advantage of the fact that people want to live here. We just have to give them something to fall in line to when they get here. We need culture. Assimilate can't be a bad word anymore. I understand that it got a really bad connotation after the residential schools thing, but the word assimilate means to adopt that melting pot mindset. Maybe the mosaic needs to melt a little bit. We need a culture. We need to assimilate. Maybe the government needs to hand out Tragically Hip vinyls at the airport along with the winter jackets, or maybe they need to ask which Hollywood actors are secretly Canadians on a citizenship test. I think most people would agree that some level of immigration and population growth is needed for the economy regardless. But the difference in that discussion about what the right level is not a bad conversation to have. The real question that we should be having under all of this is, what do we make the people fall in line with once they're here? What does it mean to be Canadian? Let's say you move to America against all odds and you enroll your kid in school there. That kid is going to become indoctrinated the first day of class because they have to stand up and say the Pledge of Allegiance with one hand on their heart before doing the national anthem and whatever else they make them do in America. We don't have anything like that in Canada. Right? Do we? No. Did they? There's nothing like that, right? The Canadian anthem is the closest thing, and we can't even decide on how that's sung anymore. There's like changes to that every year. Fun fact about the Canadian national anthem, it was written by a guy who used to do blackface. Not that one. No, not that one either. The other one. The French really used to run Canada, bro. Like, they really used to say, no, whatever we say goes. I like that mentality. Canada needs that mentality. The biggest problem that Canadians face, outside of the fact that nobody assimilates into anything, is that we have diaspora politics. That means people come from all over the world to live in Canada, and then they keep their politics. They keep the politics of the place they came from here. We need to fix that, okay? The future leadership of Canada needs to make assimilation a priority. I understand the economy's in the dumpster, people can't afford a place to live, and these are also concrete issues that need to be addressed. But the Trudeau reign has showed us that the esoteric problem, like women's rights and climate change, can actually be a priority in the government's mandate. Even though they don't have concrete metrics associated with their success, we can still take these lofty goals, and maybe creating Canadian culture should be one of those goals for the next party. So why don't we add that philosophical question of what it means to be a Canadian onto the plate of the next leader in Canada? Maybe we as Canadians can afford to be a little dumber. Maybe we don't need to have an opinion about everything that's happening all over the world. Do I need to have an opinion about politics in India just to enjoy a fucking Tim Hortons coffee? Listen, Canada, number one. If you want to live here, you better at least believe that that's true. All right, so what are we going to do about culture in Canada? Well, the number one thing is we have to start supporting Canadian creators. That includes me. So subscribe to this YouTube and then follow other Canadian creators. This has been Slava P. I think multiculturalism is unknown. Bye.